My name is Fida Adely. I'm an associate professor here at Georgetown and in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, and I'll be chairing the panel today. So I'll begin by introducing our two speakers and then hand it over to them. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Francesca de Chatel. Dr. de Chatel, following extensive travel and research between 2001 and 2005, published a nonfiction general audience book entitled Water, Sheikhs, and Dam Builders, Stories of People and Water in the Middle East in 2007. She lived in Damascus from 2006 until 2010, where she worked as the managing editor and editor-in-chief of Syria Today, an independent English language current affairs magazine. And during this period, she continued to write about different aspects of water and scarcity in Syria and the region. As an editor and project manager, she has worked on a range of water-related publications and projects. She's currently based in Amsterdam, and she recently obtained her doctoral degree and continues to work as an editor, researcher, and writer with a focus on water in the Mediterranean basin. Our second speaker this afternoon will be Dr. Karen Rignall, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Rignall is a cultural anthropologist currently completing a postdoctoral fellowship in the Agricultural Economics Department at the University of Kentucky. She'll become an assistant professor in Community and Leadership Development in the Community and Leadership Development Department at the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food and Environment in the fall of 2015. Her research interests address agrarian transformation, land tenure, and environmental change, especially in the oasis valleys of southeast Morocco. Recent research explores the transformation of landscapes and land tenure through a renewable energy program in pre-Saharan Morocco, comparing solar power and extractive mining in terms of their effects on livelihoods, the creation of value in land, state territorialization projects, and collective mobilization. So I welcome you both, and we'll begin with Dr. de Chatel. Thank you. Just press that.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me. I'm going to speak today about water and the impact of scarcity on the environment and populations in the Middle East and North Africa. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on my experience in Syria, where I lived from 2006 to 2010. Partly that's because I was there and I did research there, but it's also, I think, in my personal opinion, the case of Syria exemplifies many elements of the Arab water crisis. It's also important to emphasize that everything I'm going to talk about is pre-2011, because I haven't lived in the region since then, so I'm not going to go into too much the events since 2011. I think, as you all know, the Middle East is facing a severe water crisis. This slide shows the very steep decline in per capita water availability since 1950. I want to look at the causes and effects of this crisis, but also particularly I want to ask why there is still so little awareness of this acute scarcity. So the structure of my talk, I'll first have a brief introduction and some background, then I'll look at environmental impact, human impact, and then there'll be a small conclusion. Okay, this is a kind of a extrapolation of the previous slide. This shows, again, Middle East water availability per capita compared to the global availability. And as you can see, there's quite a difference. As you can also see, the Middle East, many Middle Eastern countries are already below the water scarcity level, and by 2050, that is going to get much more pronounced. This is all statistics, though, and it's quite abstract. So I just want to also show you what it means in practice. So this is the Barada River, which is the river that feeds Damascus. The Barada Valley lies to the west of Damascus. It's in the Anti-Lebanon mountain range, and the Barada River used to flow through the valley into Damascus. Damascus is actually an oasis in a semi-arid desert environment. So the Barada River is fed by several springs. This is an image from 1900, and this is an image of Damascus in 1900 when it had just under 150,000 inhabitants, and you can see behind, so you can see that it's a quite arid environment, and behind you can see this was the Ghouta oasis which used to surround Damascus, and which was all fed by the water from the Barada River, and also from local springs. Anyway, okay, so this is the Barada River in 2009, and this is Abu Mohammed, who is a fruit grower in the Barada Valley. His family had orchards in this area for 3 generations. This is the bank of the Barada River. Now the reason that the river has dried out is because the water is taken from the source and pumped straight from the source to Damascus to provide drinking water for the population there, because Damascus has grown massively since 1950, and today it's a city of more than 6 million inhabitants. So that's the Ghouta, basically, it's gone. So this is just to illustrate the very sharp population growth that has impacted the whole region, and to kind of put more of an image to it. So region-wide population growth, I think this is data that you all know. But so there's been massive population growth, but in addition there have also been great population shifts. So with the creation of the State of Israel, the creation of nation states after 1950, there have been great shifts in population, and there's also been great shifts from rural areas into urban areas. So these are like the base data, or the rough data, how do you say that, the bulk data, but it's also important to look at where these populations have settled and where they are concentrated, and in many cases they're concentrated in areas where there is not much water, which further complicates the situation. The rapid growth in population and the creation of new nation states in the 20th century meant that there was a need to develop water resources, and there was massive development. The region embraced the hydraulic mission, as it's known, and invested huge amounts of money and manpower in the development of water resources. This is an image of the construction of the Aswan Dam. Throughout the region, many dams were built. In the 1970s and 80s, the introduction of motor pumps also allowed for drilling much deeper and extracting groundwater at rates that were previously unknown. This also changed the perception and people's valuing of water. I think this is very important because until then the Middle East has always been a water scarce region, and until technology was available, there was also a valuing of water as a scarce resource and as something precious. And this is also apparent in the religions of the region. But with the arrival of technology, there was an idea that water and nature could be controlled and that there was an endless supply. The slogans that were promoted by governments like "Not a Single Drop to the Sea" and "Making the Desert Bloom" suggested that there was no end to what technology could bring, and has therefore created an over-reliance on technology. An important motive for this great technological drive was the desire to achieve food self-sufficiency, which is something we also heard about this morning. Agriculture has also always been the traditional base for Middle Eastern economies, and the massive drive to expand irrigated area was also coupled with large exploitation of groundwater. So today, this has led to a situation where 85% of the region's water goes to agriculture. But nevertheless, water use continues to be very inefficient, and efforts to change this have not had much success. So in most countries, in many countries, the crops that are being planted are low value, the irrigation practices are very wasteful, and there are subsidy systems in place which are difficult to dismantle. Moreover, water is essentially for free in many countries, which means that, again, it's undervalued. So the combination of the man-made scarcity and the natural scarcity has led to the water crisis that we're seeing today. Just some images of what that looks like. This is an image of the Jordan River at the baptism site. And that was in 1900, and this is today, or 2 years ago. So this is the Jordan River, and this is Jordan, and this is Israel. This is the lower Jordan River. So the reason that the river has shrunk so much is because of upstream water infrastructure projects, so the national water carrier in Israel, but also damming on the main tributary of the Jordan River, the Yarmouk in Syria, and damming in Jordan. This is actually about 1 meter deep, so the pilgrims, there's about 1 million pilgrims who come every year to baptize in the Jordan River. This is about, they can't actually immerse because that's part of the ritual. You kind of have to lie down sideways to be able to be baptized, and this is actually mainly sewage water. So this is one of the images of how surface water has been affected by the massive development and overexploitation of water resources. As a speaker mentioned this morning as well, the decline of the Jordan River is also affecting the Dead Sea downstream, which is shrinking rapidly. Groundwater is also affected. This is a photo of the Ras Al Ain spring on the Syrian-Turkish border. This is part of a series of springs along the Syrian-Turkish border. This used to be one of the largest karst springs in the world, and it dried out completely in 2001. The cause is that there have been 2,000 wells drilled in Turkey, which are being used to irrigate cotton, and on the Syrian side 4,000 wells have been drilled, also to irrigate cotton and wheat. The remaining water is often very polluted as a result of the release of wastewater. So wastewater is hardly treated. In most cities in the Middle East there is either no wastewater treatment, or the treatment plants can't cope with the amount of wastewater coming in. And also there's a high salinity of return flows from irrigation. So for example, the Euphrates, once it crosses the Syrian-Iraqi border, is no longer suitable for use as drinking water because of its salinity. And once it reaches southern Iraq, the salinity is up to 6 times over the acceptable limit. And on top of that, there's untreated sewage in it as well. Now, this has been briefly mentioned this morning, the role of climate change in all of this. The debate, obviously climate change is a factor that needs to be taken into account, and there are many studies that show that the Eastern Mediterranean is going to be heavily impacted. It obviously plays a role, but in most countries, and certainly in Syria, the mismanagement and overexploitation of water is a much more important factor and plays a much larger role in having triggered the water crisis. This is an interesting example. This is in eastern Syria. This is the first nature reserve that was created by the FAO. It's called Talila. The Syrian Badia, the steppe, was nationalized, I think in the 1960s, if I'm correct. And before that, it was managed through the HIMA system. And then when it was nationalized, it was basically a free-for-all. And everyone could graze as many sheep as they wanted to, which led to this kind of situation. This is beyond the fence, there's no grazing. And so you see that here the steppe actually regenerates. The sheep population in Syria, I think, has grown even faster than the population of the country, and they're mainly in the Badia. So this is one of the reasons that the Badia, the ecosystems in the Badia have suffered very heavily. Another aspect of the climate change issue is that it leads to a kind of overemphasizing climate change, also leads to a kind of shifting the blame away from the policies that are not being changed, not being reformed, by just putting the blame on climate change and not accepting that there needs to be some fundamental reform in the water sector. So I think the images I've shown show that there is a water crisis, but at the same time what keeps surprising me is that there is still such a lack of awareness. And I've been thinking a lot about how this is possible, that the scarcity is so apparent and yet it's so unacknowledged. So there are a number of reasons that I've listed here. So this is again before 2011. I think now it's possibly worse because water has been pushed further down the agenda. So in the Middle East, the regional instability, the lack of security means that water is just not seen as the most important thing because there are political tensions, there's conflict, and this takes precedent. Another issue is that the authoritarian regimes in the region have created very centralized water management systems which lead the population to feel a lack of involvement or responsibility in the water. So traditional water management systems were often based on small communities and people, there was like a joint management, but the management as it exists, for example, in Egypt today is very centralized and makes people feel like the government should give them the water instead of that they should also contribute to managing it better. Then there is the undervaluing of the resource, which I mentioned before, that in many countries water is almost for free and it's not seen as a precious resource. Then there is the over-reliance of technology, which I mentioned before. And then there is an issue that the scarcity is also in many places quite local. So in cities, for example, it's rare. I will exclude Palestine from that, but in cities it's rare for water to completely run out. So in Damascus there is effectively acute water scarcity, but you can live there and not feel the scarcity. The same goes for Amman, where there is acute water scarcity, but you always have water coming out of the tap. So the water has run out in figures, but it's still there, so people are not sensitized to it. And then there's the issue that it's a gradual process. It's not like a tsunami that hits and is devastating. It's not that you one day go to the river and it's gone. It's a very slow process, and so the impact is less immediate and devastating than other natural disasters might be. But nevertheless, it does have a very serious human impact, which I would like to illustrate by talking a bit to you about the drought in Syria from 2006 to 2010 and the situation there. So a bit has been spoken about this morning on this issue. So I'll just put it in place for you on a map. So this is the Jazeera area of northeastern Syria. This is the main agricultural region of the country. It's also the main oil-producing region, and at the same time it's the least developed and the poorest region of the country. So while Syria as a whole, after 2000, poverty was declining and there was development and economic growth, this region of the country, poverty was increasing and food insecurity was increasing. The story I'm going to tell you is about a village called Tel El Banat, which was a village in the Euphrates Valley. Hafiz al-Assad built a series of dams on the Euphrates in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and a lot of the Euphrates Valley, which is the most fertile ground, was flooded, and the populations that lived here were relocated. Partly they were relocated in new villages that were built here on the border, but many of them didn't go there. They refused, and many of them also couldn't prove that they owned the land that they were farming in the Euphrates Valley, so they didn't have a right to land. So many of them also stayed on the shores of the new dam reservoirs. They just moved their villages up, and it was actually illegal for them to do that, but they stayed there nevertheless, and they paid the security services to just turn a blind eye. So this is the case as well with Tel El Banat. So this is a photo of a neighboring village. This is Tel Aber. So here you see this is the flooded village of Tel Aber, and basically they've moved the village up the road, out of the lake. So this is Tel El Banat, which is the irrigation water they were pumping up illegally from the dam reservoir. And it was a very small village, small subsistence farming, poor. So I visited this village several times, and then I started a kind of a project in which I started following the dispersal of the people from these villages through Syria as the drought hit. But it soon became apparent that many of them had already left before the drought because the water in the region had already run out. So this is a tent camp just outside Damascus. These are actually people who have lived here for 10 years. They moved when the Tishrin Dam was built. Instead of moving elsewhere in the Jazeera, they came to Damascus in the hope of finding a better life. And this was 10 years later. They were living here. Then the drought hit. So the drought has been much written about, and much has been made as well of the links between the drought and the start of the Arab Spring in Syria. Just to give you some facts and figures, 2007 was the big drought year, the worst drought in 40 years. And then in 2008, it was the first time that Syria imported wheat in 15 years, because until then Syria had been a wheat exporter. The estimates were that 1.3 million people were affected in the northeast. Farmers lost 90% of their income. Herders lost 80% of their flock. 300,000 people migrated from the northeast mainly to Damascus and the southern governorates. And then they started living in just these ad hoc tent camps outside in the Damascus suburbs and in the southern governorates. In 2010, 3.7 million people, which is equivalent to 17% of the Syrian population, were food insecure. how the government responded to this was initially by trying to cover it up, ignoring it, and then downplaying the gravity until they saw that it was really serious, and then they tried to get, they made several UN appeals to get food support and support from the international community, which failed quite dramatically. Obviously, this is one of the camps that sprung up. So this camp was, when I went to, there were about 100 tents, but the camp had existed for 10 years already. It's just that it grew massively when the drought hit. So I guess what's important to note is that the drought played a role in the uprising, but the displacement and the discontent especially was way predated the drought. And that poverty levels in the northeast had been rising already before any of the drought started. There were also many who had gone to Lebanon, and now this again is in Lebanon, at the back of a disused parking garage, Syrian workers. Of course, this Syrian workers going to Lebanon is something that has a long history and had been going on, but there were more and more of them, and many of these men had already been there for 8 or 10 years. They were not only from the Jazeera, they were also from Aleppo, they were from Idlib, and they were all there because they were farmers and the water had run out. I think, in conclusion, I think it's clear that long-term mismanagement of water and land had a heavy impact on the environment and on rural communities in Syria. Yet the government continued to ignore and downplay the situation instead of confronting the fact that its approach to water and land management required fundamental change. Obviously, the events since 2010 have only pushed water further down the regional agenda, and now they have been overshadowed by the political unrest and conflict in the region. But in other countries as well, water and water scarcity is becoming a growing problem, and more attention needs to be focused on improving water management and on highlighting the crisis, because the link, as we've also heard this morning, the link between water, food, social stability, it's very close, and it's I think underemphasized, which is not a word, but anyway, okay, thank you very much.
So now I'd like to welcome Karen Rignall. Karen.
Yeah, thank you. Like the other speakers before me, I'd like to thank the conference organizers. I have learned a tremendous amount from all of you, and it's just such a privilege to come and have this conversation with people from so many different perspectives and disciplines. Today I'm going to talk about land and the politics of value in unconventional gas, and I'm going to focus on a sort of political ecology approach. And I'm particularly interested in the meaning and impacts of unconventional gas for those involved with or living near the point of extraction, as well as the implications of unconventional gas for understanding the relationship between energy, political authority, and capitalism. And I've had some semantic struggles, which we talked about from a technical perspective this morning. There are many things that we can call it, and actually, for the sake of reducing my syllables, I'm just going to call it fracking for most of the presentation in this particular context. So I'm interested, following an anthropologist who works on this, Anna Willow, in asking, how are community structures, social networks, land use decisions, and the cultural meanings of rural landscapes changing? How is this kind of energy development, in particular, transforming people's experiences and understandings of the landscapes they inhabit, utilize, and protect? This presentation extends research I have conducted on solar energy, and this is in Morocco, in relationship to land tenure. I'm going to extend that project and start to consider the implications of fracking or unconventional gas and oil as it relates to land rights, ownership, livelihoods, and relations of power. I'm at the beginning stages of this research project, so my comments today are primarily programmatic and conceptual and at somewhat of a general level. My field research to date has explored this renewable energy dimension in Morocco. I plan on doing field-based research about possible fracking in Kentucky, where I'm based. Although I won't use very many statistics or technical data today, I do want to focus on how statistics and technical data acquire meaning and are marshaled by all sorts of groups to shape our understandings of fracking. So to do this, I use a sort of broad theoretical framework called political ecology, which is in the title of the symposium, so I felt like I could spend a little bit of time on the way I approach it. Paul Robbins is a prominent geographer who's written on political ecology extensively, and he defines it as empirical research-based explorations to explain linkages in the condition and change of social and environmental systems. And here he's emphasizing with explicit consideration of relations of power. Political ecology, moreover, explores these social and environmental changes with a normative understanding that there are very likely better, less coercive, less exploitive, and more sustainable ways of doing things. And I'd just like to emphasize here that this is overtly political, but political is not necessarily polemical. All of our discourse is political, and so often a desire to avoid polemical discussions means we marshal statistics, but I'd like to emphasize that science is as political as any other discourse in being situated as a form of knowledge production. So my research in Morocco is related on some basic levels and obviously very, very different in others. But it did, sort of my interest in unconventional gas was sort of encouraged by this conference, but I also live in a state that has a long tradition of extraction in the form of coal. So I started actually by doing field work on agrarian change in southern Morocco, but while I was there, a solar plant was being proposed by the government as part of a broad renewable energy plan. So in 2012, I conducted some research in the pre-Saharan province of Ouarzazate, where a concentrated solar power installation, a 500 megawatt facility, is actually currently under construction. I actually presented some of my preliminary thoughts on this here at the center that year. So I examined one particular piece of this project. It was the Moroccan government's acquisition of collectively owned land. And I wanted to see how progressive narratives of renewable energy can actually join entrenched modes of governance, in this case to secure control over marginalized populations and kind of capture the economic rents that were embedded in their collectively owned land. My goal was not to argue for or against solar power, but to understand how marginalized populations figure into energy production, and how even renewable energy schemes can have complicated and often negative impacts for groups ill-placed to advocate for their rights and needs. So solar power emerges in this context as a socio-ecological relation. It's certainly ecological, but it's fundamentally social and political as well. And the inexhaustibility and cleanliness and immateriality of solar energy can obscure the social relations necessary for its production. So residents living around this proposed solar installation were very critical of it. They were critical of the way the government acquired the land and went about the project's planning. And I can get into the details of it, but I'd like to get to the sort of fracking discussion. They were not only interested in who or who would not benefit from the plant, their concerns echoed the experience many have had with both renewable and extractive energies, which is top-down planning, not participating in the long-term economic benefits. So not just the sale of a license, and in this case, there are no royalties. Other experiences involve land and other natural resource dispossession, foreclosure of livelihood activities, among others. So the relationships here involve fundamental questions of resource access and political power. When I began learning about fracking in the US and Australia in particular, I realized that some of the processes I observed are common across different parts of the energy landscape. So we need to pay attention to the specificity of each energy source, but we also need to think about their commonalities and where those commonalities may have come from. And this raises questions of who actually controls these energy landscapes. We can't just focus on who owns the land and how the transfer of ownership or subsurface rights occurs, because land ownership is just one aspect of land tenure, and it can often in itself be embedded in long histories of dispossession. So who actually owns the land and sells their mineral rights? They may have little power over what is done on that land, and they may find that their control is sort of progressively removed over their livelihoods in the broader environment. So, here we go. The way these kind of energy projects may affect people is through political economic arrangements that reshape governance in very fundamental ways. So that's led me to think about what could we consider as the possible land tenure impacts of unconventional gas. Now, examining the different discourses around fracking is more than I can really do in 20 minutes. On the one hand, it involves claims about the necessity for energy independence, the role of gas in an energy transition, in some cases patriotism, that we need to disengage from the Middle East. We need to use our lands and resources productively. On the other hand, the discourses evoke long histories of extraction, often from very marginalized regions, and the differential ability of residents to control the extraction process. It involves environmental impacts that are often difficult to ascertain because of the proprietary nature of the chemicals used, and also questions about the efficacy of regulations. All of these are important issues. There are many other health impacts and other things as well. These are all important issues, and they're unfolding not only in academic and policy circles, but very much in the media. But I'd like to focus on my research on land tenure in particular. Beyond the direct impacts on health and the environment and local community dynamics, fracking can reshape land tenure dynamics, and in the process, relations of power and governance authority between different groups of people, the state and corporations. We need to attend to more than land values and prices, though. We need to pay attention to the ensemble of land tenure relations that shapes who has power to decide what happens on the land, how what is produced or extracted generates value and wealth, and finally, what land uses should be privileged. Now, throughout this presentation, I'm trying to point out maybe what is new with fracking, but also the continuities with other forms of energy extraction. So, I'm an anthropologist by training, and so that's what I'm primarily drawing on for this presentation. And I'd love to be able to talk a little bit about some of the pictures. There's actually, if anything, much too much in terms of images and discussion about fracking, so that it's often quite difficult to get a handle on what is really credible. But there's also some interesting and great visuals. I've drawn some pictures from a great exhibit at the Field Museum in Chicago, which used quite beautiful photography to sort of explore the ambivalence of the fracking experience. I put some of those pictures up. This particular case is a very controversial one. You could read the caption, but I could perhaps talk about it later. So fracking is an outgrowth of established energy production patterns, but it's also a novel socio-technical phenomenon. So the importance of establishing continuities is that there are some troubled sort of histories of earlier resource extractive eras, sort of unmapped, abandoned, and decaying infrastructure from previous oil and gas extraction is one example. We have this big problem with mining in eastern Kentucky. And so it raises for many the failures of effective regulatory oversight that are actually, in some cases, coming to light as debates about fracking become more prominent. So it's not only that fracking is raising new issues, but it's also forcing us to think back about the legacy of previous sort of energy regimes. But the debates about fracking and the way anthropologists have dealt with them have focused on issues that some of you have talked about, and again are sort of too detailed and in certain respects not enough data. So we have environmental effects, water pollution, very crowded roads that are not able to handle the truck traffic, spills and other issues regarding wastewater, and then the boomtown phenomena, which those of you who study energy would know much better than I, but the question of housing shortages, rising housing costs, infrastructure pressures, and then the sort of removal of the tax base or unutilized capacity after the boom is over, although there's a lot of controversy about what the boomtown phenomenon has actually looked like over the long term. There's an increase in non-resident workers, industrial transformations, but anthropologists have tended to focus on some of the sociocultural effects. So they've talked about, for instance, feelings of disempowerment. So one example in Western Pennsylvania from Simona Perry spoke extensively with residents who described declining home values, disputes between neighbors who felt differently about fracking, even fears for physical safety because of pressure and sometimes bullying tactics. And people said they no longer had the ability to determine what takes place in their immediate environment, which was a new experience for them. One of the people she spoke with who had actually did lease land and had been quite supportive and wasn't unsupportive as a whole, said, you know, if these trucks were all painted green, you would think we were being invaded. He described how this place that he had always called home now felt occupied by the natural gas industry. So there's a lot of ambivalence. There's a lot of social pressure in many cases going both sort of for and against drilling in these areas. Many felt trust in the Department of sort of Environmental Protection, in this case, in this Pennsylvania example. You know, one man saying they wouldn't allow gas development if it was as bad as the tree huggers claimed. Narratives of patriotism from this area in Pennsylvania that really, Bradford County, had a long military history of families who were very supportive, felt like this was a part of their contribution to energy independence. But the rapidity of social changes in a 3-year period left many people reeling. So many of those who had felt quite supportive were dealing as early as 2010 with a feeling of loss and not knowing how to interpret the way fracking had changed their environment. So anthropologists have focused on the way fracking reshapes social fabric, sometimes dividing communities, but also in other cases bringing formally disparate communities together. The fact of this ambivalence and many of these observations raise questions about how then we evaluate the effects of fracking and what kinds of effects are privileged or taken seriously. Discussing emotional trauma and road conditions can sometimes feel very trivial when we're talking about such important issues regarding national security, energy, but they are very meaningful and important to the people involved, and they form part of the profound impacts of extraction, especially as they relate to health, environment, and land tenure. So what anthropologists and geographers, thank you, examining this sort of sociocultural dimension of fracking call for is this idea of kind of going beyond the census. We need to also think about what's beyond the tangible and directly observable events. And so land tenure tunes our attention to how, in fact, fracking may reshape authority. So why do I use the term land tenure as opposed to land prices or values? Because land tenure is more than just the way land is valued. It's about the juridical, economic, and political relations that cohere around land. It determines not only ownership but use and how sovereignty and ownership is transmitted over time and space. Notions of property centered on the Euro-American model, privilege and exclusive model of ownership, But even in the most commoditized capitalist context, ownership is never pure. This sort of autonomous owning subject is never realized in practice. There are always overlaying rights and authorities. So I'm going to focus the remaining part of my discussion, if I can find page 6, on sort of 3 kinds of questions then, if we do focus on the sort of non-tangible, is how do we know impacts? What are the politics of knowledge that are involved in shape how these various impacts are evaluated? How do we regulate impacts? What forms of governance shape what gets regulated? And then how do we value resources and what politics of value dominates? So, as many scholars note, as many people note, there's much we don't know yet about the way fracking and the chemicals used affect human, animal, and plant life. There's some that we do know, but there are many questions about risks. But risk itself is a culturally perceived danger. And it is at the crossroads between technologies of diagnosis and quantification and then legal standards established to protect citizens from harm. So the primary way that we get to know risk and understand these impacts is often through social impact assessments. And they're one of the primary mechanisms that bring together this disparate knowledge of impacts. But these assessments privilege cost-benefit analysis as the legitimate way of evaluating fracking. And they marginalize discourses that interpret fracking in non-economic terms, so issues of landscape history, emotional trauma, localized health effects, often appear as non-economic, subjective, qualitative. Power imbalances here shape whose voice is heard and what knowledge is valued in these assessments. So in one social impact assessment in Queensland, Australia, anthropologist Kim de Rijk found that very narrow reporting requirements and very rigid definitions obscured these sort of complex social dynamics, raising questions of how do we define free and prior informed consent? Who has the authority to give consent on behalf of communities? So there is some work that's been done on valuing in an economic sense, and including a really interesting study by a Duke University economist, Timmons, that used sort of home sales data to quantitatively assess the impact of fracking. And it yields very interesting results, but they're very ambiguous, and there's not one conclusion you can make. There's heterogeneous impacts across space and time. But the issue with that as well is that even the notion of property value and the use of very fancy econometrics, which I'm quite jealous of, because I'd love to be able to do that, these sort of econometric methods to measure externalities can't get at some of the issues of land tenure change that I've observed and that others have observed. So how then do we regulate impacts? How do we get what kinds of governance shapes what gets regulated? Social impacts assessments are the sort of stepchild of a lot of the regulatory process. They're often identified with red tapes, and requirements are frequently diluted. Often the local government, state governments that are deriving revenues and stand to get revenues that meet much needed budget gaps are also in charge of the kinds of impact assessments. And corporations often have a very direct influence on the way these assessments happened. And there's a great diversity of jurisdictions for regulating and extraction. So in some cases they remove local control, in other cases home rule allows for corporations who are interested in drilling to negotiate on an individual basis. And then there's the issue of remediation, which has a sort of long and problematic history in many parts of the U.S., as particularly in the case of eastern Kentucky. There are issues with the fact that regulations may look good, but remediation doesn't often work. And in any case, I'm making a broader argument that what we're seeing here are land use changes that aren't remediated, because it's a very profound change in how land is used and valued, and you can't reseed grass when these profound economic and social changes have happened. There's often no way of going back. So finally, how do we value resources? What politics of value dominate here? Drilling is an important source of revenue for individual landowners and for state and local governments. I've referenced, and you're all quite familiar with the importance of also contributing to energy independence. And this defers questions about why existing land uses are no longer providing adequate livelihoods for people. So an important set of values are being brought to bear on the land that I looked at in Morocco and some of these lands throughout the US, that we need to find their more productive use. We need to put marginal lands to good use. So land in these places is constructed as empty or unproductive to pave the way for these energy investments. But they may not be unproductive and marginal or empty to their users. This was a very pointed picture that appeared in the social impact assessment for the solar energy project that I looked at. It makes it look like Mars. But in fact, these steppe lands are a crucial part of the extensive pastoralist livelihood system that's here. This land has been collectively owned for many hundreds of years, and local residents would tell you that it's not marginal at all. So I want to end with the idea that land, property, mineral rights, they serve a social function that's far more complex and rich than a narrow definition of productivity would allow. But we have to value that social function in order to be able to weigh it in relation to economic valuations of property. And that's a tough challenge when these are not subject to quantifiable estimations. The boundary between those who benefit from energy extraction and those who bear its burden seems to be shifting with new energy technologies and new energy landscapes. I'm not offering definitive conclusions here, but calling for explicit scholarly policy and governmental attention to the ways that inequality and power shape who has the right to decide what happens on and under the land. Thank you.
So I believe our third panelist has joined us. Are we? Yes, okay. So I'm going to introduce our third panelist who had some flight issues, but has luckily made it on time to join us. Dr. Jim Beech, professor at the University of Texas, Austin. He's a professor of geography and environment at the University of Texas, Austin, and he was formerly the Cinco Hermanos Chair and Professor of Geography and Geoscience here at Georgetown, and the Director of Georgetown's Program in Science, Technology, and International Affairs, and the head of its Center for the Environment. He's conducted field research with hundreds of students on geomorphology and geoarchaeology in the Corn Belt of the United States, Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Syria, Turkey, Iceland, and Germany, funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Geographic Society, USAID, and Georgetown University. And these field seasons have been the basis for more than 80 peer-reviewed publications and hundreds of scientific presentations around the world. And his research focuses on soil and agricultural systems, geomorphology, water, environmental change, and geoarchaeology. He was elected as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and awarded a Guggenheim and Dunbar and Oaks Fellowships, the G.K. Gilbert Award in Geomorphology in 2010, and Georgetown's only Distinguished Research Award in 2010. And it's a pleasure to welcome you back. Thanks.
Well, I'm so sorry I couldn't have been here for the whole conference, and sorry I missed so many of these talks. I was lucky to make it in with the giant icebergs that are descending upon Boston. Ironically, I came from Austin at 79 degrees yesterday to Boston at 12 degrees last night and gave a talk at the Boston Museum of Science on a very different subject, but I will try to dovetail them together. Last night it was on, I don't know if I can fit that guy in there, on looking at the evidence we have to try to bring the paleoclimatic record to bear on environmental problems of today. And I think one of those I guess by the training that we have. One of those is that is the long-term kind of historical record of different civilizations. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. And I also had originally planned to be in the first session, so was going to kind of set the stage and talk about environmental problems, which you've probably heard about all day long, and last night as well with Peter Glick speaking. So some of that I might go through fairly quickly and focus in on more of my own research, which some of the stuff, I will have to say, yeah, it doesn't matter where you are, you have the same group of technical problems as we did in the Boston Museum of Science last night. So I want to give you an overview of the environmental impacts, because again, I thought it was going to be in that first session, of shale development and some insights from paleoclimatology. Most of those are going to be from our own current work. Some of it's not published yet, and it makes me excited to present it to you because it's just new stuff right out of new laboratories that we're just building at the University of Texas. I will have to say that I first came here almost 22 years ago to the month to lecture. My first lecture at that time was how we needed to take climate change seriously, and my last lecture here is that as well today. So this is an interesting thing, obviously, from US politics, with new terms being coined like fractivist, and it's always fractivist versus industry, activist versus industry in this case. And this discussion then by some, it's kind of a wedge discussion between environmentalists, for those who would like to see us use this as a bridge fuel moving into a lower carbon future. And I think that that's a strong possibility, but it also has some other problems associated with it that we'll talk about. And ironically, Jerry Brown has not banned fracking, but Andrew Cuomo did, and of course it's probably something that some of our Californians already spoke about. So kind of a wedge amongst progressives, though this is on the geology perhaps as much as on the political aspects of this. All right, so I'm going to give you a little deep time first. Now, none of you would have expected this, but actually we did have a geology talk earlier on, so probably would have expected it. This is a diagram that I'm going to point out a few things for you. This happens to be a product of one of my students from Georgetown who went on to do her PhD in Scripps. And this is a long-term history of a climate record over time. This is by Norris and by Sandra Kirtland-Turner, who's now a professor at UC Riverside. And over on this side is industrial amounts of carbon dioxide. And this particular axis, the y-axis, is millions of years ago. You're going to say to yourself, why is that important? And the reason why is that 400 parts per million, you have to go back well into the tertiary period to get to those levels in completely different climates and completely different environments. And that's kind of your takeaway message under extreme warming conditions. Thus drives that importance or questions of doing something about the carbon. That's the 300-pound gorilla of fracking and every other topic we talk about, is to do something about the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Now, that's the first case, and we'll come back to a more specific case in a moment. The second one is probably a diagram that many of you have all seen before in talks here today. I thought this might be one of the earlier times we were using it. But of course it shows the process of trying to get gas out of these tight formations, which is in itself geologically a really interesting thing. And it's an interesting breakthrough that happened between government and scientists and industry. So it's one of those interesting areas where all of them played an important part in that. But it has effects or impacts on each point along the way. And I know some of you talked about the impacts on water earlier in one of the talks. So the challenges then are coming from a lot of different sources. The proppants are the solids that keep induced fractures open, like sands and ceramics. Those don't cause as many problems, but there are a lot of other toxic chemicals that we've already seen and we've talked about probably. They're usually trade secrets in the United States, although that needs to change. How do we develop risk management plans and understand health effects without full knowledge of all the chemicals? Some states, of course, have required fuller information on that. The hydraulic fracturing, typical of shale wells, uses a lot of water. I think Mark Giordano talked about that before. It's not a lot in terms of total percent, but it's a lot when you're having a small or certain particular areas that are having problems with water. So coming from Austin, Texas, and looking at a reservoir that's at about 10% capacity or so behind where I live, and many of the other reservoirs around there, when you're using millions of gallons of water, it becomes a real problem or question. It's particularly a problem down in these water-poor regions, maybe not, or maybe less so in other areas. But there's also cases then of water abstraction from water ecosystems, as well as the blowback water that comes back out of these systems, and surface spills, and a whole group of other kinds of environmental problems. Surface water contamination with the spills of poor construction. Some groundwater contamination with fluid released. Usually, again, it's poor construction, which some people have argued we can fix. If it's simply a matter of engineering, then we can fix that, and it's something that we need to do. I'm going to move on to seismic impacts you've probably talked about and heard about today. It's a serious issue, the 4 scale earthquakes being induced and increased swarms of earthquakes in certain parts of the country. Not all of those can be connected to hydrologic fracturing, but some of them can so far, and some have been demonstrated to be that. We're going to need more monitoring and observation of that. And then methane leakage is one of the bigger ones along the way, and the reason why that one gets us back to carbon then, because this methane that's coming into the atmosphere is obviously the biggest problem in the world. And we thought that this kind of work, this kind of gas development, was the kind of thing that was going to decrease our carbon footprint. It's supposed to be something like half the amount of carbon released from coal. But we've seen in a number of different studies that have been coming out evidence that there's more leakage. Now, there's all sorts of different counter-arguments to it now, but I think we're strongly in an area of needing more monitoring and observation about all aspects of that. One of the chief environmental scientists of the world said, let's not worry too much about these things. It's too important a technology for us to turn our backs on. We have to put our time and money into the engineering to make sure that it is this bridge technology, though. I'm going to move past these. So the next one I'm going to do is to try to make the strong case then for why I'm a fence sitter on this. I'm a fence sitter because, one, I know that it has a good end, and that is the potential to decrease our total amount of carbon going into the atmosphere, and potentially as a bridge fuel as we move forward to a lower and lower carbon economy. But I also see all of these environmental problems that people have talked about before, and all of those are serious problems that need to be examined and need to have good social justice as part of those. So I'm going to use one example that's come to play, and I'm going to use this example in changing from what I had talked about before in the years I was here. For years, I'd always been a skeptic of large-scale environmental changes causing major changes in civilizations. But over the last couple of years, there's been enough information come forward on one particular area, and some work that I'm doing there and some of my colleagues are doing, that I think now this is a pretty strong case for us. And I think it is, in a sense, a case for a climate change that may have been a knockout blow to a civilization that gives us pause to think about going forward into this period where we've never seen the potential for climate change. So, I'm going to go to the Maya lowlands, where I've been studying for many, many years in this environment. I just throw up a climate graph of this region. The great collapse of the Maya lowlands occurred here in the 9th century or so AD, although populations continued for a long time after this. One of the things you see, and all geologists, all geoscientists look at squiggly lines and try to make some information out of that. What we see is periods of wetter and drier conditions, and these are from a whole group of different studies. Some I've been part of and some I haven't been a part of. And one of the things you see, and just right out of the lab, is that you had a really wet period 2,500 years ago, and it was followed then by an extremely dry period around 400 years ago. This is a new, I don't know if you've ever heard the term before, it's a new speleothem, which means it's a cave stalagmite that we've just been studying from a cave in Yucatan. And what's interesting about this one is we've never seen this strong evidence for this kind of drought at this period. And this is the period which was a decline of Maya civilization in the late pre-classic Now, what happened after that is, if you go back to the previous one, is you had tremendous wet period occur through the classic period, and that's when Maya civilization came back in a strong way. But what happened then after this, and I think it's the most interesting part of it, as we go through from this dry periods into this wet period, and then some minor droughts, was a gigantic drought of 100 years long. We're still trying to figure out what the cause for that is, what the climatological cause for that drought is, but it was one that did finally put an end. It was the uppercut that put an end to this central Mayan civilization. We think now, after looking at this evidence for a long time. So the takeaways from that, I think, is that I had always been skeptical about our paleoclimate records saying something about the modern world, but this evidence looks so much stronger now that I think it does give us a thought and a parallel. And it's a point where paleoclimate and archaeology can say something to us today. Well, and maybe this gets to this point, is shale gas a win-win that is going to decrease our carbon footprint in the world as a fuel source, and also potentially a place to get rid of some of the carbon dioxide as well, and sequestration? We need the monitoring by independent sources for gas leaks. We need full disclosure on chemicals used. We need cost accounting of real water costs, both in water removal and water pollution for storage and processing. Fairness to overlying inhabitants, as we just heard in the last discussion. But the ultimate bias and differential impacts on humanity are by the excess carbon we're putting in the atmosphere, because that's going to influence the most people in the coming future, or not very long in the future. Can shale gas and oil be one of the lowering wedges of carbon that allow us to bridge to carbon reduction to avert catastrophic climate change? It's my last question. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. So now we're going to take questions. There's a mic on either side here. And if you'd like to ask a question, just come up to one of those microphones and just tell us who you are and who you're addressing your question to. And I think Karen has stepped out for a moment, but she should be right back.
Hi, Fida.
Yeah, hi, Tim.
Welcome back, Tim. Great to see you. Tim, what is the connection between increased temperatures by carbon loading and drought? You mentioned, you really emphasized climate change, but then you talked about drought rather than temperature, and I'm wondering what kind of connection do you draw there?
Well, the large graph that I showed was actually a drought graph, the middle one from the classic period, or from the pre-classic period. And going forward into the future, I didn't use the usual kind of graph that we have from so many different studies that looks at the areas that are differentially affected by climate change. But it's pretty clear with one study after another that places like the southwestern United States, as climate change occurs, global warming occurs, are getting drier and drier. I think Texas may be an example of that now, not far from where I live, in California for that matter. And most of those Mediterranean-like environments around the world then, if you go and look at each of those maps. It's interesting too that the Maya lowlands where I've been working all this time is also one of those places that is really affected and becomes drier. And that's where we're trying to figure out what the trigger is, in that case, the actual, I'm just going to use terminology, synoptic climatological trigger for droughts like that.
Could I just follow that up, Tim?
Sure.
Because this is my ignorance, but I wasn't aware that we have enough evidence yet to be confident about the impact of the warming of the climate on the distribution of precipitation in various areas. Are you saying we now have enough evidence to say that that's...
I think there's enough evidence to come to that conclusion, because there's enough models now and enough historical records that make it pretty clear that those areas that I outlined before are the areas that are going to succumb to more and more drought. Said the same thing as well a few years ago in Qatar on a similar talk like this, in fact. So I think we've known that pretty well for, I hate to go back too far, but for the last decade or so, where those major areas of drier conditions are going to be.
Hi, I'm Rochelle Davis, a professor in CCAS, and hello, everyone. I was teaching until about 3:15, so I missed Francesca's presentation, and I got just the end of Karen's. But I wanted you to ask, and maybe you addressed this in your talk, and so maybe you can just expand, actually, all of you. I was teaching a refugees class, and so I am interested in how you see these sorts of changes that you're documenting and commenting on actual human population and settlement, and specifically sort of in the next 10 years, how we might be shifting to think about environmentally induced displacement and what that means and how we're going to have to sort of change our definitions or not, or how we're going to create different categories, or just some of the sort of forecasting out that relating to sort of human settlement and human forced migration.
Yeah, whoever would like to address the question, because I think yeah.
This issue came up in my research in a number of ways. I work on a smaller scale than virtually everybody here, but I work in an oasis valley where in the mountains climate change has been very visible to residents who practice extensive pastoralism. And with a drought in the 90s, it just didn't become economically viable anymore. And so you see regional movements of populations where those people who had been living up in the mountains are no longer able to practice pastoralism, move down into the steppe, placing additional water pressure but land pressure. And those are people living in that open steppe where they're building the solar power plant. And so what you see are these sort of regional movements that are really invisible even to national statistics in many respects, but really fundamentally change not only the way people use land and regard land, both juridically and sort of effectively, but also the economic meanings of that land, because agriculture isn't really possible, or at least cultivation isn't really possible. In fact, speculative uses of land become important. And so you see cascading results that happen from these population movements, and to unravel them is very complex. It's sort of interesting, though. The area I work is not the last area of oases before you get to the Saharan desert, or the full-on Saharan desert. It's the second to last. So in the last set of oases, people have started going up to my oasis, the place where I work, for the summers. And the residents have started calling them environmental refugees because it's too hot down in the Drought Valley. And so they come, they rent places for 3 months, and they're termed refugees. So the politics of this are very interesting.
Anyone else want to address this question?
Well, I guess I could comment on Syria. In Syria, traditionally already, I mean, for years there was a migration, which was, but it was more a migration of young men or men going from the rural areas to work in cities, to work in Lebanon. So this had been happening for years, and there's a lot has been written on that as well, particularly with the migration to Lebanon. But this was a circular migration, so it was when it was not the agricultural season, they would go to the cities and their families would stay. What happened in the 2006-2010 drought is that you saw whole families leaving their land, and I guess with the hope of returning, and some of them did return, but many did not, and had really just closed their houses, and even taken apart, they'd really taken all the roof beams out of their houses, the wood, which was the precious part, and put them on carts and just abandoned their villages. So, of course, in the context of Syria, it's a bit difficult to comment on how that's, well, it's difficult to comment on anything in Syria because you just, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's difficult now to see how water is going to influence, or scarcity is going to influence population movements in the future, because I mean, no one is living where they used to live virtually anymore, so it's a bit difficult to speculate on that.
I might just add to, I mean, Karen, your point about kind of trying to measure social impact seems sort of related to Rochelle's question as well, right? Like, how can we even predict these kind of patterns, right? Or how do we account for the potential of that kind of impact, right?
That's a really difficult question,
Yeah.
because I obviously think accounting for those impacts is very important. But how do you find a way of giving space to different discourses and valuing different ways of understanding experience, not simply in order to give people voice, but because it has very serious livelihood impacts for them. And often for people who have literally no access to any form of advocacy or remediation or participation in governmental processes. I do believe they matter quite significantly, but many of the impacts we talk about are simply difficult to measure.
And I would just add, at the broadest scale then, since we went from the smallest to the middle, back to the broadest scale again, I should have brought in, and I don't know if Peter Glick did last night, a map of various groups of models that show these areas getting drier. It's palpable to look at the map, because you see just how many areas around the world are going to have, truthfully, I mean, it's going to be a big business in studying refugees, because there's just going to be so many more, I would say, without trying to overstate it.
Thanks. Osama Murshid, CCS. So Karen, I want to resume the conversation I had with the previous panel, since we're dealing with issues of governance and how the distribution of resources could impact governmentality and specifically state-society relations. But I wanted to also suggest maybe a comparative model for what you're investigating at the moment, because it's reminding me of North Africa in a different historical era when we had this example of communal grazing lands being subjected to newly instrumentalized laws and interpretations of customs in order to transfer these grazing lands to the public domain by proclaiming that they are now forests, or that they're going to be needed for forestry. And so what you have here is the case where not only is this an instrument that secures the control of the state over this resource, but it also makes sure that traditional ways are no longer possible, because it has simply destroyed all kinds of socio-economic organization that were built around a particular kind of land tenure and land usage that is no longer possible. So,
Absolutely. Osama's referring to sort of French colonial juridical arrangements that that effectively controlled extensive pastoralism and mobile populations for political and sort of economic reasons. But interestingly, those legal frameworks are very much in operation in Morocco. They changed significantly in Algeria, although arguably not for the better. So in fact, the law used to transfer this land from this collective group, this tribe, to the state was a 1919 law put in place by the French to expropriate collective lands. And so they were paid a symbolic amount of money, but in the French colonial period, tribes that were receiving money for their collective lands couldn't keep that money. The state was its tuteur, the tutor, and kept the money on behalf of these tribes. And in fact, over 100 years later, nearly 100 years later, the state still has that money. So the state paid itself for this land. And then in social impact assessment documents for this solar energy project, it says that the residents were compensated according to the law. And this is when we need to think very seriously about what the law does. Because it was to the letter of the law, but the law relies on a history of pretty profound dispossession. Naming things is a very important process. Regulations that appear exceptionally dry, but that name resources in particular ways, will have impact decades, sometimes centuries into the future. And so we need to pay attention to those dry local regulations, because they will foreclose or open possibilities for many people in ways that they can't anticipate.
I wonder if I could ask, is Rochelle still here? Yeah, I'm right here. Oh, Rochelle, I know you've been working on migration in this area. I wonder if you could talk about the place of environment within the total impetus for migration. I mean, how big a deal, we're kind of focusing on environment here, But where would you put it in the spectrum of causation for population movements in the areas you've worked in?
Apologies, I think Jim just hijacked me into your panel, but.
Come have a seat.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it is all, so I think there's two ways to look at it. The 1951 UN definition of a refugee is someone who flees across their country's borders out of a well-founded fear of persecution. So the environment isn't in there at all. It's about fear, it's about war, it's about oppression, those sorts of things. So more recently, we've shifted away from a term of using refugee to using a term of forced migrant or forced migration, and that's when the world has been able to look at environmental causes in a much more meaningful way. But yet, someone like the UNHCR, which is the protection agency for refugees and usually the one that registers them, they don't come in necessarily when there's an environmental crisis or something. So we're much more likely to see what we call IDPs, internally displaced persons, people who stay inside their country, be affected by environmental issues and move because of environmental issues, be forced migrants in that sense, than we are to see refugees. Refugees usually are much more about war. I mean, I'm really generalizing here. And because an IDP is still a citizen within the state, they stay there. Now, there's of course exceptions to that, but I mean, my question was sort of looking at if we're going to see a lot more of this in the future, how is that going to change our notion of a forced migrant? And how are we going to start in the kind of legal way that we think about a refugee and a forced migrant, how much more environment is going to be a part of that, and are we going to, start funding, aid? We do fund aid for people who are forced migrants because of hurricanes or floods or those sorts of things. The aid community mobilizes for that. But if it's small-scale displacements by a solar project or because of global warming or because of droughts, I think, at least in the Middle East, we've seen less aid mobilization around those issues. Does that kind of answer where you're going? Sorry.
Thanks. Sorry for showing up again. But I wanted to ask Tim, thanks for being with us, Tim. I know you went through a lot to get here, and I appreciate it. But is your last point possible in the context of the reality of the Middle East, specifically the Gulf, and its over-dependence on carbon energy? If I'm reading, I can't read it, but this is what you're actually saying.
I think it is relevant in a lot of ways. There's a lot of gas, potentially. I mean, there's a huge amount of gas that's used in the Middle East. It has a lower overall carbon footprint if it's done right, if it's used right, and used in as many different ways. And so that's possible for one of those wedges away from, the dirtiest, the worst thing we could talk about is not shale, but, it's mountaintop removal of coal, for heaven's sakes. I mean, it's going on for a long time. It's not a Middle Eastern problem. But certainly the fact that there's so much gas in the Middle East, I think is one of those areas that could be used if it's done with the best engineering to decrease our total carbon footprint, I would say.
But this would be the context where the availability of water is rather critical, right?
Yeah.
Because you were kind of putting that as a sort of a tipping point between whether it may be beneficial or adverse, right? Is the usage of water in fracking.
Right. Well, so that's the aspect of it is, in that case, and it depends on the kind of water, it depends on how worthwhile that carbon that you're trying to get is, because water may become, much cheaper in that case, although we tend to think of a water future as being water getting more and more expensive over time. So I think it has a strong Middle East component to it. And that's another way potentially to do this would be to do it with plentiful saline water sources, right?
Well, we wish you were here this morning because we had a lot of these same topics coming up.
Yeah, I wish I were here. too.
May I impose on one and ask one more question for Francesca, because it's obviously a lot of these case studies are taking place in the territories that are now the heartland of Islamic State. And so I know it's very difficult to understand what's going on. I know you haven't been back, but it doesn't sound like a complete coincidence, right? If you look at events today and you're kind of connecting it to the drought. But is there anything you'd like to elaborate on this point, or is it just conjecture at this point?
Yeah, I would be speculating. I don't. It's yeah. I wouldn't say there's a direct connection between the water scarcity and then becoming a violent Islamist, but I think that definitely that area. It's more about. So I think one thing I find very important is it's not about just 4 years of drought. It's the length of. This was always the back end of Syria that no one wanted to. It was an area that was, first of all, rebellious. It was a Bedouin area that was very hard to control. So then under Hafez al-Assad, no, before Hafez al-Assad even, they what I mentioned, they nationalized the Badia, which was in effect an effort to stop nomadism, so to stop the Bedouin tribes that were actually managing the steppe there through the Hima system, which was a system actually of collective management. That was completely abolished, and they settled the Bedouin tribes, and they even did it in a way where they put them all in different villages, so they completely pulled them apart in an effort. So it was they basically said we've abolished the tribes, just heck. And then the what happened from there was that this area was they just tried to control it, but there was never any development. After 2000, there were all these projects where they said yes, development for the northeast and blah blah blah, but nothing ever really materialized and was actually followed up on, even though, kind of contradictorily, it is the breadbasket of Syria and it is the oil-producing region. But in terms of, so I think there's a statistic that in Raqqa governorate in maybe 2006, 39% of the population was illiterate. So, and whereas the rest of Syria has very high literacy rates. So this is also in the communities where I went, like most kids didn't go to school. They were just pulled out of school at the age of 11 and they went to work on the land. So I think that there's a long history of dispossession. If then also the water runs out, these people living there had no alternative. The people I spoke to, they said, okay, well then I go to a city. What do I do there? What I know how to do is how to farm. That's what I know how to do. That's what I am. I don't know anything else. So I think that the lack of opportunity as well that was offered to people, rural communities in Syria, growing gap between the rich and poor under Bashar al-Assad, I think all of that certainly contributed to what's happening there now. The exact location of IS in that region, I can't comment on that too. It's for sure though that before, like in the late 2000s, there were training camps in the Syrian desert of jihadis who were being sent to Iraq, and the Syrian authorities absolutely knew about that. So it didn't just all of a sudden appear. I mean, they were there already. It was being, it was there.
Hi, I'm Marwa Daoudi from the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. I'd like to go back to the debate on environmental refugees and link it possibly to the discussion we had this morning about security, linking the environment and security. And this is a comment, but also if the panelists have, comments about my own comment, I would welcome that. The danger here is, again, to securitize the environment and securitize the environmental refugees, in the sense that this is a term which was coined in the early 80s in policy papers, later taken up in the Stern report in 2007 in relation to climate change. And environmental refugees or forced migrants or internally displaced migrants are seen as potential security threats. So not only are they victims of the environment, are they victims of mismanagement and also of repression. Often they're seen as sources of insecurity internally. Wherever they move to, they live in slums because they're neglected, but they are seen as the instigators of political and social unrest. And if they go across the border, they're also seen or conceptualized as fueling conflict in other neighboring countries. So I think this whole concept of environmental refugees should also be taken with some precaution, and the whole debate about the environment triggering conflict as well from that individual and population perspective is also double-edged in that sense. Thank you.
There's something new about the way these categories are being applied to people and groups of people in response to contemporary situations, but there's also a very old narrative about the threat of mobility. And in that sense, some of the sort of regard of these populations as threats draws on very old, usually colonial methods of control and repression. And so that can be a really unholy combination, unfortunately.
Any other questions? Yep, we have one more.
I wanted to ask Tim about his assertion that we need full disclosure on chemicals used. To my knowledge, there are no chemicals that come on site on a well, whether it's a drilling, just a plain vertical well or a fractured horizontal well. No chemicals come on site without a material safety data sheet, and the MSDS was created so that we could track the potential impacts and the preferred remediation approaches without having a PhD chemist on site. And as I understand it also, virtually all the chemicals are disclosed. Their exact chemical formula may not be disclosed, and the only reason for needing the exact chemical formulation instead of the class of chemicals in which it belongs is attribution. In other words, lawyers looking for deep pockets. The real environmental impacts are addressed primarily by knowing what might be affected and what you've got to do about it. And that is, in fact, fully regulated. And although the industry has moved fairly strongly towards relatively full disclosure, not perfectly full disclosure, is it actually necessary? And is that the whip of attribution absolutely necessary? And for that matter, should it not be acknowledged that we already have the knowledge to address the environmental impacts, that it isn't about that we need any greater disclosure than is already there? And will the chemical companies be forced to do the same at their plants if the oil industry has to do it?
I don't really have a comment. I take your point very well. And it's an excellent point you make about that. And I think the question and difference is those who do think that slight variations on those things may have certain kinds of ramifications they hadn't thought about before, or even that broader groups of people are fearful that they aren't being told what is there. And full disclosure always leads to other problems as well. I know in a lot of different ways. It's the same debate we had here about whether or not we disclose GMOs on labels for food in the country. And it was an interesting panel we had on that same discussion, which people differed in that view as well. So.
Yeah, I'm Peter Glick, and I wasn't going to say anything, and maybe we can fight over this over coffee. And this is really more of a comment than a question. My apologies to the excellent panel. We don't have full disclosure in any sense of the term right now. We have some voluntary disclosure. We don't have full knowledge, even if we had full disclosure of the interactions among these chemicals, because we don't do those studies. So I would just push back a little bit on your argument that A, we have full disclosure, B, if we don't quite have full disclosure, does it really matter? I would argue we don't, it does matter. We have a long way to go before we have a full understanding of the kinds of issues that Tim raised in terms of the need to decide whether or not to pursue more aggressive expanded oil and gas production. And then just, I can't resist, but a quick question for Tim. You've sort of left us with this last question. Can shale oil or gas be that bridge to avoid catastrophic climate change if we could define catastrophic climate change?
Well,
But you didn't really answer it. And I realize that it depends on, well, let me just make this one comment and then leave it to you. We're not pursuing expanded oil and gas for the purpose of it being a bridge.
Right.
Because we're not explicitly saying, okay, we'll do this and replace higher carbon sources of emissions. We're doing it to expand production. But I don't know if you have any comments on answering your own question.
Peter, it's an excellent question. I left it as a question on purpose as a panel discussion rather than to try to fully answer it, because I don't know if we can answer at this point, one, and two, I don't know how long some of the fracking areas are going to play out. There's been some interesting discussion about how much of a future there is for certain areas. Is this going to be, for the United States, for example, a temporary thing that's going in and changing the energy portfolio, or is it going to be a longer-term thing? Certainly in the Middle East and a lot of places that have a lot more easy-to-get gas, that's gas that can be that bridge. It's an excellent point. I don't know if I have anything further to say about it, Peter. I guess the only other thing I would say is, are we done or no?
You can make your final comment, and then we'll be done.
Well, the one thing I would say is that I think that, and I said this before, but I think Peter probably agrees that we're going into a completely different world for all of the cultural, social questions that we've discussed or that you've discussed and others that I've read about from your abstracts. And the only analogs we have are deeper history, deeper geological history. And one of the ones that always comes back to mind is the time period where the highest population of North Africa is about 7,000 years ago, when it was a steppe. And it had a pretty decent amount of forest around oases as well. And all of those people are gone. And all of them had to go somewhere. And that's more like the potential for the kind of global warming future I think we're going into. And that's what I think we need to do more research on.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists.